They handed out champagne at the gates, but they handed me rejection. The guard looked straight at me and said, "You're not on the list." But what they didn't expect was that I'd come not as a guest, but as a 4-star general. And when I stepped through those white roses, everything they thought they buried rose with me. My name is Lucinda Barrett. I'm a mother, yes, but I'm also something they never counted on. A woman who survived betrayal not just in family, but in uniform. And this is the story they tried to erase. Until I made sure the whole world saw it. Stay with me. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the start of something louder. I parked 2 streets away from the Langston estate, not because there wasn't valet, but because I needed those few minutes of silence, of air, of remembering who I was before I reached the gates. The invitation was still resting on the passenger seat beside me, sealed in its original envelope. Cream-colored, thick cardstock, gold-embossed initials D&M. Damon and Marlena, my son and his bride. The kind of invitation you send when the wedding isn't just a wedding, but a statement. When the guest list is curated more carefully than the vows. I'd opened it the day it arrived 3 months ago. Damon's handwriting was scrawled in blue ink inside. I know things haven't been easy, but I want you there. Please come. There was even a little underline under please. I had held that invitation like a fragile truce, maybe a beginning. But that was before the silence returned. In the weeks after, every time I called it went to voicemail. Every message I left was met with nothing but static. At first I told myself he was just busy. Caught up in the wedding, the pressure, the planning. But then Marlena's mother gave an interview to a lifestyle magazine. An entire article about the Langston Barrett union describing how Marlena was bringing fresh dignity to a legacy family. No mention of me. Not even a polite lie. Just nothing. I didn't press. I didn't argue. I just circled the date on my calendar and kept showing up to my own quiet life. I still wore my uniform in the mirror every few days. Not out of vanity, but memory. I needed to remind myself of who I had once been, of what hadn't been taken from me. That morning I dressed slowly, not in the uniform, not yet. I chose a navy blue dress suit, pressed and classic, the kind of thing I'd worn to Pentagon luncheons and funeral services. I pinned my hair back in the low bun I'd always preferred. Simple, tight, professional. I didn't wear makeup, just balm on my lips. My face had never needed softening. I folded the uniform into a garment bag and left it in the car, out of sight. The Langston estate loomed ahead like a page torn out of a luxury home magazine. The gates were flanked by marble lion statues. A fountain bubbled in the center of a circular drive lined with perfectly pruned boxwoods. Everything about the place said, permanence, pride, pedigree. I didn't belong here. But I also didn't flinch. I joined the small line of guests arriving through the main path. Everyone was dressed in pastels, flowing silks, and sharp suits, gold jewelry that caught the afternoon sun. There were smiles, laughter, little whispers behind champagne glasses. I moved through them like a shadow with a name. At the entrance arch, lavender draped, dripping with roses, a young man in a dark suit held a guest list on a clipboard, an earpiece looped around his jaw. He wasn't military, but he stood like someone who thought he knew power. "Name, please," he asked without looking up. "Lucinda Barrett," I said, calmly, no explanation, no embellishment. He scanned the list, flipped a page, paused, then looked up. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on the approved guest list." I didn't react immediately. I reached into my bag and pulled out the invitation still in its envelope. There must be some mistake. This was sent to me months ago. My son. He took it, slid the invitation out, and his brow furrowed. Then his expression went flat, professional, almost rehearsed. He tilted the cardstock toward me. That's when I saw it. My name elegantly printed under the phrase, "With love and honor we invite," had been crossed out, not erased, not blurred, crossed out, once with a thick red stroke. As if I were an error on a form, as if my presence was never meant to be welcomed, only removed, my breath caught, not in shock but recognition. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. It wasn't enough not to invite me. They needed to erase me publicly, deliberately, without ambiguity. Who amended the list, I asked quietly. I'm not at liberty to say, he replied. I didn't argue. What was there to argue? A couple behind me began to whisper. I felt their curiosity press against my back like wind. A woman in stilettos sidestepped around me, flashing me a tight smile. Polite pity. I nodded, stepping away from the line. I walked down the curved path toward the edge of the estate where the shade from an old oak tree offered cover from the mid-afternoon sun. I stood there for a while, watching the guests move past me like I was invisible. This wasn't the first time. 6 years ago, I'd walked out of a courtroom in uniform only to be met by silence from every person who once called me family. Damon had sent a single text back then, I need space. And space was all he ever gave me. But this was something else. To be written out of your own child's life, on his wedding day, as if I were the problem that needed deleting. And yet, I didn't feel rage. I felt precision. They had underestimated me again. Slowly, I reached into the small tote bag slung over my shoulder and pulled out the garment bag. I unzipped it carefully like a ritual. Inside was my full dress uniform. Dark green, tailored, immaculate. The metals shimmered against the fabric like hard-won truths. The 4 silver stars on the shoulders were polished to clarity. I slipped out of my coat and slid into the uniform. My hands moved without hesitation, every button fastened with the certainty of muscle memory. This wasn't just clothing. It was a language, one I had spoken with my life. The sun hit my chest just as I stepped back onto the main path. A soft gasp echoed from a cluster of guests near the rose hedge. One woman dropped her mimosa. A photographer camera already raised tilted his lens toward me without fully understanding why. And then silence. I didn't need to say a word. I just stood there, 4 stars gleaming under the golden light, a quiet storm the estate hadn't prepared for. I hadn't come to crash the wedding. I hadn't come to beg for a seat or plead for understanding. I came because I was erased. And no one erases a general without remembering her name. 8 years ago, I stood at a podium in a windowless room deep within the Pentagon, dressed in my Class A uniform, facing a wall of cameras. I remember the sensation of my collar pressing too tightly against my throat, though I'd had the jacket tailored only weeks earlier. My chest bore 32 years of service, yet the only thing anyone wanted to see was whether I would flinch. I didn't. The press conference was brief, cold, scripted. I was informed that I was being relieved of duty pending an internal investigation. They used sterile phrases like operational misjudgment and breach of classified handling protocol. Behind their words was the unspoken truth someone had leaked sensitive information to a foreign actor, and my command had been the last signature on the chain. I knew the file, knew the name of the junior officer who accessed it, knew the timestamp and location. I also knew the investigation wasn't about truth. It was about containment, image, public reassurance, and I unfortunately was too visible. They didn't strip me of my rank that day. That came later. What they took first was the narrative. By the next morning, every news outlet had plastered my name across their screens. 4-star hope falls from grace. Hero or hazard. General Barrett. Under fire. I wasn't even a 4-star yet, but that didn't matter. The headlines didn't chase facts. They chased fear. Damon didn't call. I told myself he was overwhelmed. Maybe his work schedule was tight. Maybe he didn't know how to talk to me through all the noise. I gave him space the way I always had. I'd done the same when he was 6 and refused to speak after his father died in a training accident. I'd waited back then, sitting outside his room reading reports by flashlight just to be close. I knew silence. I had survived it before. But this silence was different. 3 weeks after the scandal broke, I received a text, "I need space. Please don't make this harder." No salutation, no mom. I remember staring at those words, thinking how strange it felt to be unmothered by your own child. Damon had always been measured, polite to the point of rigid. He was the kind of boy who color-coded his school folders, who triple-checked his homework. I'd raised him to be precise, to be proud. I didn't think I had also raised him to be ashamed. But when your name becomes synonymous with disgrace, even your own blood will start scrubbing the walls. My mother called me once during that time. Just once. I hadn't heard from Elaine in over a year, not since I missed Thanksgiving while deployed overseas. Her voice was as brittle as ever. "You've embarrassed the family," she said. "Just let this pass quietly. Please. For Damon's sake." I didn't respond. There was no point. They didn't want my truth. They wanted my disappearance. The court-martial came swiftly, a performance with no audience, except the few who needed to be seen taking action. I sat through every hearing, every debrief, every glance that asked, "How could you?" and every silence that meant, "We never believed in you anyway." No one asked me what really happened. Not once. When the ruling was delivered, dishonorable discharge, early termination of service, forfeiture of pension, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood saluted and walked out with the same posture I'd entered with. But something inside me cracked. Not loudly. Not like a break. More like the quiet shift of a load-bearing beam finally giving way. They took my nameplate, my uniform, my access. But the worst part, they took Damon. I tried to write, just once. "I know this looks bad. I know you're hurt. But I need you to believe in who I am." I never got a reply. Instead, weeks later, a mutual friend forwarded me a picture of Damon at a tech conference in Chicago. He was on stage presenting a blockchain software for private equity firms. Standing beside him was a tall, elegant woman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The caption, "Damon Barrett and fiancée Marlena Goss poised to redefine smart finance." That was the first time I saw her. I remember thinking how small he looked in the photo, smaller than I'd ever seen him, like someone who had traded a backbone for a brand. The weeks bled into months. My bank account dwindled. My name became a liability. I couldn't even book a hotel under Lucinda Barrett without getting flagged. So I disappeared. I sold the house, bought a used truck, drove west without a plan. In Colorado, I found a mechanic who needed help lifting generators and fixing battery rigs. I didn't tell him who I was. He didn't ask. I paid cash for a small trailer outside of town and kept my head down. People called me Lou. I answered. The woman who had once briefed Joint Chiefs of Staff now patched tires for retired ranchers. And strangely, it was the first time in years I didn't feel watched. But every night when the wind howled through the trees, I'd remember Damon's face. Not the adult version, the child, the boy who used to crawl into bed beside me during thunderstorms, who asked me once if soldiers ever got scared. I'd told him the truth. "Yes," I said. "But we don't stop." Sometimes I wondered what he would have said to me if I had shown up at his door in Boston unannounced. Maybe he would have turned me away. Or worse, looked through me. Invisibility, I've learned, is worse than anger. You can rage against cruelty. You can fight lies. But you can't punch through nothingness. And that's what I'd become. Not disgraced. Not hated. Just nothing. In the little town of Morgan Ridge, Colorado, no one knew who I used to be. No one cared. They knew me as Lou. The quiet woman who fixed electric generators and drove a rusted red Ford that rattled when it reversed. I kept mostly to myself except for Tuesday afternoons when I ran a basic pistol skills class for local retirees out behind the VFW hall. I didn't advertise it. Word just spread. They came with old hands, arthritic wrists, and heavy memories. I taught them to breathe, to aim, to hold steady. Sometimes I wondered if any of them had served under my command decades ago, but no one ever asked, and I never offered. The trailer I lived in had a single room, a leaking faucet, and a heating unit that wheezed when the temperature dropped, but it was mine. I kept my uniform folded in a chest under the bed. I opened it only on nights I couldn't sleep, just to make sure it was still real, that I had once been someone whose name meant something. Every year on Damon's birthday, I sent an email. Just one. Short. Never angry. Never desperate. Happy birthday, Damon. I hope you're well. I'm thinking of you today. I never got a reply. At first I imagined he was reading them quietly, secretly, that he just didn't know how to answer. Over time I began to accept the likelier truth he'd filtered my messages to spam, buried me with a click. I stopped expecting his name to appear in my inbox, but I couldn't stop sending the messages. They weren't for him anymore. They were for me, a lifeline to the past that hadn't entirely rotted through. I'd made peace with anonymity. There was something clean about it. No performance, no permission, just routine and quiet. Then one evening in late spring, the silence cracked. I was under a Ford Bronco replacing a cracked oil pan when my prepaid flip phone buzzed. That thing only rang once a month, usually from the guy at the parts yard letting me know he'd found something useful. But this time it wasn't a familiar number. It wasn't even domestic. I wiped the grease from my hands and answered without thinking, Lou speaking. Lou o tatsinkan. There was a long pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a decade, clear, precise, unmistakably military. General Barrett. I froze. No one's called me that in years, I said. You still are. Whether they say it or not. The voice belonged to Major General Anthony Greer, my former CO when I was stationed in Stuttgart. He had once written my performance review using the phrase cold steel under pressure. He had also vanished from my world the day my reputation imploded. I thought I was radioactive, I said, walking outside into the crisp air, phone pressed tight against my cheek. You were, he replied. And maybe you still are. But some of us don't stop watching. I didn't speak. I didn't know what to ask. There's a team being assembled, he continued. Off book. Discreet. Black ops, but not in the flashy Hollywood way. This is deep tier. Eyes only. You wouldn't be under any branch. You'd be under people who don't even have nameplates. Why me, I asked. Because we need someone who understands failure, and who didn't deserve it. The words landed harder than I expected. No one had ever said that out loud before, not once, not even a whisper of doubt in the official version, just silence. And he added, because someone high up still thinks you're valuable. This wasn't my call alone. I exhaled, slow and uneven. What's the catch, I asked. You'll need to disappear. Again. Officially, you'll remain a dishonorably discharged officer. No public redemption, no parades. Your name won't come back. You'll go by a call sign only. No history, no records. I looked up at the Colorado sky, pale blue and cloudless, that kind of empty that feels heavy. You'll be kite, he said. If you say yes. I paused. Not because I was uncertain, but because the part of me that had stopped hoping suddenly started breathing again. I'm not who I used to be, I said. Good, he replied. Neither is the world. He gave me a drop location, a flight manifest, a burner set of credentials. I know what they did to you, he said, voice low now. I know you didn't leak that intel. I know the fall wasn't yours. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my small table staring at the old photo of Damon I kept taped behind the cupboard door. He was 8, missing a tooth, holding a Pinewood Derby trophy I'd helped him build. I reached for the keyboard and opened a blank email. I might be going away for a while. You probably won't notice. But if you ever wonder, just remember I always showed up when it counted. Even if you didn't see me, I didn't send it, just saved it to drafts. By morning, I'd packed a duffel with everything I needed. I left the trailer key in the mailbox, taped a note to the fridge for the mechanic, Thanks for the work. Keep the tools. And then I drove. I drove past the edge of the known, past the name they tried to bury, into the silence that this time I chose. They called me Kite now. Not Lucinda, not General, not Mom, just Kite. No one asked where I came from. No one questioned how a woman past 60 could scale walls faster than most rookies or field strip a weapon blindfolded. The few who noticed simply learned to stay out of my way. I belonged to no branch, no badge, no flag. I existed between layers of classified silence where identities dissolved and only outcomes mattered. The mission was the name. The first was in Syria, an extraction. Our intel said a defense contractor had been taken by paramilitaries buried somewhere in an abandoned textile facility on the outskirts of Aleppo. We went in under the cover of night. 4 of us, no insignias, no backup. I led the entry. My knees didn't care for concrete anymore, but they bent when I told them to. We found him. Bloodied, bruised, dehydrated, but alive. He looked up at me through one swollen eye and asked, "Are you real close enough?" I said, and carried him out over my shoulder. That became the rhythm of my life. Move, infiltrate, extract, burn it clean, move again. In Sudan, we tracked a shipment of weaponized pathogens that had gone dark somewhere between the border towns. I found the crate in the back of a livestock truck, sand pouring through the cracks in its lid. My breath caught when I saw the stamp. Department of Defense Property. That one hurt more than the desert heat. In Qatar, we ran financial intercepts through proxy servers in the basement of a diplomatic compound. It was there I started hearing whispers about shell companies funneling U.S. assets through private holdings overseas. Names floated past us like shadows. Al-Taim Holdings, the Carthage Fund, Maverton Global, Maverton. That one rang. I'd seen it before, somewhere I couldn't yet place. Then came Lisbon. The mission was routine, or so we were told. A contact embedded in a telecom firm had flagged strange financial routing codes bouncing between private satellites and encrypted defense channels. The kind of code only high-level insiders would recognize. He claimed to have proof. Raw, unfiltered. We were told to retrieve the file. Quietly. By the time we arrived, the building was on fire. We found the contact. A man named Nils, half conscious in the stairwell, coughing blood, trying to hold onto a scorched briefcase. His hands were trembling. His face was blistered. He grabbed my arm with what little strength he had left. In my boot, he rasped. I reached down, tore the heel apart, and found it. A microdrive. Rough, scratched, no label. "They'll come for you now," he whispered. "But not just for this. For what you were." Before I could ask what he meant, his eyes went still. We barely made it out before the roof collapsed. Back at base, I sat alone in the comms bunker and slotted the drive into a red-line terminal. Though, encryption was tight, but I'd learned how to pick locks a long time ago. The folders were a mess. Fragments of emails, internal audits, offshore account lists, code names. But one name kept appearing. Over and over. Maverton Holdings. Underneath a board of directors file. Photos. Titles. Financial disclosures. And then I saw it. Declan Goss. I stared at the screen for a long time, unmoving. Declan Goss. CEO. Lead investor. Primary shareholder in nearly a dozen shell companies tied to government contracts and tech procurement fraud. I knew that name. I knew that face. Not because I'd worked with him, but because I'd seen his arm wrapped around a young woman's shoulder in a magazine feature titled "The Wedding of the Year." His daughter was marrying my son. Damon. Marlena. I pulled up the photo from the article I'd saved months ago. More out of ritual than sentiment. There he was, Damon, smiling wide, standing beside Declan on the stairs of some stone estate. Declan's hand on his shoulder like a father giving away something precious. I felt something cold slide down my spine. I'd spent years thinking my downfall had been a tragic accident. A bureaucratic failure. A scapegoating of convenience. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had orchestrated it? Not to shame me, but to remove me, quietly, permanently, because I knew too much, because I would have gotten in the way, because I was inconvenient. My hands were steady, but my breath felt ragged. I copied everything onto a secure drive and encrypted it with 3 layers of firewalls. Then I sat in the dark listening to the hum of the generator, letting the truth bloom like a bruise under my ribs. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was personal. I remembered Damon at 14 talking about starting his own firm someday. He'd been so proud, so sure of himself. I'd encouraged him, paid for his first finance camp, helped him practice interviews. Now, he stood beside a man who might have helped orchestrate the very thing that ended my career. And I wondered, did he know, or worse, did he choose not to ask? There are silences that sting louder than bullets, the kind that come not from absence but from avoidance, the kind you don't hear until you realize no one ever planned to speak again. After I found Declan Goss's name connected to Maverton Holdings, something inside me turned cold. Not with panic, no. That would have meant I was caught off guard. It was something deeper than fear. A stillness. A click. The way puzzle pieces feel just before they snap together. I began to suspect that my fall from grace wasn't just a convenient headline. It was a strategy. And I was only one move on someone else's board. I needed to know. So I went back to the beginning. Every night I carved out hours between operations, between weapons maintenance and tactical prep, and I did what no one else had ever bothered to do. I re-examined my own case like I was the investigator, not the accused. The files hadn't been erased, just buried. The military doesn't destroy anything. It just files it where people stop looking. I tunneled through the archives using my encrypted clearance on the black net maintained by intelligence alumni. The kind of space where truth still flickered faint, but not yet gone. What I found wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Too quiet. My court-martial documentation had always pointed to a single digital signature. Someone who had logged into the classified server at 02:47 on a Tuesday morning accessed a sensitive file related to defense satellite positioning and then forwarded it to an external IP address traced to Eastern Europe. The signature had been mine, except it wasn't. I knew my habits, my schedule, my clearance patterns. I'd never accessed that file. I never even had reason to. But someone else had. And buried in the metadata was a notation I had missed before. An earlier failed login attempt just 11 minutes before mine was logged. Same file, same access point. But under a different name, Colton Rivas. I hadn't thought of him in years. Staff sergeant, logistics specialist. He'd been assigned to my command unit in Stuttgart during the final year of my service. Efficient, unremarkable, dependable. One of those soldiers who rarely spoke unless spoken to, who worked best in the background. He'd been the one who trained most of our younger techs, and the one who had logged into my system the day before I was charged. The day after the leak, he disappeared. There was no discharge paper, no resignation, no MIA report. His name was simply gone. That night I sat in my bunk long after lights out, just staring at the flickering terminal screen. Why him? And more importantly, why now? I remembered something from months earlier. A conversation with a former contact who had mentioned seeing Rivas, alive, walking into the corporate lobby of a Maverton Holdings satellite office in Zurich. I hadn't paid attention then. The name meant nothing to me at the time, but now it was ringing like a bell I couldn't silence. I sent out feelers. Quietly. I knew better than to rattle doors before knowing who was behind them. 2 days later, a message came through my unlisted comms line. Unmarked sender. No greeting. Just 3 words. He wasn't alone. Attached was an encrypted file. It came from Rain Morgan, a former lieutenant in my intel division. She'd taken early retirement after a sniper round shattered her hip on a mission in Kandahar. We hadn't spoken since my court-martial. I wasn't even sure she'd kept tabs on me. But apparently she had. Inside the file was a clipped audio recording, background static, canvas flapping in the wind, the unmistakable echo of voices inside a military field tent. Then it came. "I didn't have a choice, man," a voice said. Low, frustrated, unmistakably American. "They came to me with an offer, 200 grand to pin the leak on Barrett. Said it was all greenlit. Said she'd be protected after they cleared her out." My mouth went dry. I knew that voice. Rivas. He sounded younger, nervous, but the words were sharp, uncoached, real. A second voice, quieter, unfamiliar, asked, "Who gave the order?" A pause. Then, "Can't say. Just know the check came from Maverton Holdings." The recording ended in a shuffle, a cough, and silence. I listened to it again, and again, not because I couldn't believe it, but because some part of me wanted to memorize the moment my life had been traded for a payout. I stared at the screen as the terminal dimmed into screensaver. I didn't move. Rain had included a note, short, terse, I was never brave enough to speak up. "I'm sorry." I didn't blame her. Bravery is a luxury, and silence is a weapon. I knew that better than anyone. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. No tears, no shouting, just a still, steady heat that sat in my chest like a coal. I thought of all the articles that called me careless, of the generals who avoided my eyes in the hallway, of the commanders who stopped inviting me to briefings, of the door that closed after my final tribunal session echoing louder than any slam. But more than anything, I thought of Damon. Of that first voicemail I left him after the scandal, my voice cracking as I tried to say I didn't do it, that I needed him to believe me, that I hadn't failed them. He never called back. He never even asked. He never said, "Did you do it?" He just disappeared. And now I understood why that silence hurt the most. Because when the world turns against you, you look for one person who'll still see you. Just one. And for me, that was supposed to be him. Instead, he stepped aside like the rest of them, like a bystander watching a controlled demolition too polite to scream but not brave enough to stop it. I had lived for years with the weight of a shame that was never mine, a ghost stitched to my name. Now, for the first time, I could name it. Maverton Holdings. Rivas. Silence. A signature that wasn't mine. And still, somehow, I had survived. It's strange the way life delivers its sharpest turns on the quietest days. I wasn't expecting anything that morning. I just returned from a mission debrief in Ankara, my boots still caked in dust, my hands calloused from 2 weeks spent tracking a rogue arms deal in the Syrian-Turkish borderlands. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that sits in your bones, that hums beneath the surface. The kind you carry not because you can't put it down, but because it's all you've known for too long. I hadn't unpacked yet. My bunk was still stripped bare, my duffel resting unopened beside the footlocker. I was making instant coffee when my comms panel blinked. Report to Base Office 3. Immediate. No tone. No context. In our world, immediate could mean commendation or court-martial. You don't ask. You show up. I pulled on my jacket, pressed down the collar, and walked the half-mile across base. No one made eye contact. That's the thing about Black Ops teams. People know when something's changed, but no one dares name it. Base Office 3 sat between 2 fuel sheds half buried behind a blast wall, no sign, no rank markers. Just a rusted steel door and an access keypad that required 2 biometric scans to unlock. I stepped inside. General Marcus Laird was already there, seated behind a bare desk, hands folded. The room smelled like old paper and bad decisions. He didn't look up immediately, just tapped a closed file in front of him and said, "Sit." I sat. He studied me for a long moment. "You've been busy," he said. "More than most would have dared after what they did to you." I waited. "You recovered 6 compromised intel packages in 4 months, neutralized a covert arms node in Cyprus, and flagged 2 major shell networks in Qatar before they hit public defense channels. He flipped the file open. I caught the corner of my own photograph. "Washington's nervous," he added. "That's usually a sign you're doing something right." Still, I said nothing. I'd learned a long time ago that in rooms like this, silence was power. Then he pushed a velvet box across the table. Black, unmarked. I knew what was inside before I opened it. 4 silver stars, polished, weighted, the kind that don't get handed out anymore unless someone bleeds for them quietly. "They've approved full reinstatement," he said. "General Lucinda Barrett, 4-star status, retroactive correction to your service record. Full honors, effective immediately." I let out a slow breath. "Public?" I asked. Laird shook his head. "Not yet. Maybe never. They still want to hide me. They want to use you." There was no bitterness in his tone, just truth, and truth I could work with. I stared down at the stars in my hand. I hadn't held rank in years. Not real rank. These weren't symbolic. They were an acknowledgement that I'd outlived the story others tried to write for me. I didn't smile. But something inside me settled. I didn't ask for this. I said not as defiance, but as fact. "You didn't have to," he replied. "You earned it long before they took it." I left the room in silence. Back in my quarters, I pinned the stars to my uniform. Slowly, carefully, like dressing a wound. Each one glinted under the yellow light, not as a trophy, but as proof that survival can outlast even the strongest rumor. That evening, just before lights out, I returned to my bunk and found a package resting on the center of my cot. White envelope, heavier than normal. No stamps, no name, just mine, Lucinda Barrett. I sat down slowly, opened the seal, and pulled out what lay inside. It was a wedding invitation. Thick ivory cardstock lined with gold foil, the kind printed by a company that charges more per word than most people make in an hour. The letters were engraved. "Damon Barrett and Marlena Goss request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration." But my name had been crossed out. A single red line, sharp, deliberate, made with ink that had bled just slightly into the expensive paper. Beneath the strike-through, someone had written in cursive, "No need to come." I stared at it for a long time. The air around me felt too still, too quiet. It wasn't a mistake, not some logistical error or forgotten oversight. This was a message, one meant to remind me that even after all I had done, even after clawing my name out of the shadows, my own son still saw me as the person worth erasing. I set the card down, stood up, crossed the room, and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, dressed in full-dress uniform stars gleaming against the olive green. It hit me then. The irony. I had just become the most decorated woman in my division. I had survived war zones, dismantled covert operations, uncovered corruption that would bring down billionaires. And still I wasn't welcome at my own son's wedding. They didn't want my silence. They wanted my absence. They didn't want a mother. They wanted a myth to forget. I sat back down on the edge of the bed. For a moment I thought I might cry. But nothing came. Not grief, not anger, just clarity. I didn't need a seat at their table. But I wasn't going to let them pretend I never existed. I looked down at the invitation again, then folded it neatly and slid it into my briefcase. Not as a keepsake, as evidence. They could cross out my name in ink. But they couldn't erase the stars I wore. They still didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't going for revenge. I wasn't going to reclaim love. I was going because someone had to remember what the truth looked like when it walked into a room uninvited. I arrived just as the sun tilted west, casting a long gold shadow across the manicured drive. The estate was larger than I remembered. Or maybe it just looked that way because I hadn't seen it in so long. Not since the news broke. Not since I became someone people whispered about instead of someone they called. The hedges had been trimmed to perfection, white roses laced over iron gates, violin music drifting from somewhere inside. It was the kind of event designed for a magazine spread. An airbrushed fairy tale. But fairy tales don't invite the truth. I stepped out of the black SUV 2 blocks away, adjusting the buttons on my jacket. My hair was tightly pinned, my posture upright. My uniform wasn't ceremonial. It was active dress. Functional. Pressed. The same one I wore the day they cleared my name in a room with no cameras, no apologies, just paper and silence. The 4 silver stars on my shoulders caught the light as I walked. I didn't carry a purse. I didn't bring a gift. I brought presents. At the entrance to the estate, 2 security guards flanked the gate. Young, corporate, not military. One of them blinked when he saw me. The other instinctively straightened his posture. Neither moved. I walked between them without a word. They didn't stop me. They didn't even reach for their radios. Because there's something in the way a general walks when she's been betrayed, cleared, and rebuilt from bone. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. Beyond the gate, rows of white chairs fanned out across the lawn, facing a silk-draped arch of orchids. Guests milled around with champagne flutes, laughing, adjusting dresses, adjusting masks. But laughter thinned when I stepped into view. It started with a murmur, soft, almost unsure. A few people turned, then more. Like a ripple moving outward from wherever I passed. One woman in a pale green dress dropped her wine glass. It shattered on the tiles beside her feet. No one moved to clean it. A man in uniform, retired judging by his posture, removed his cap as I walked by. I didn't look at them. I kept walking, across the stone path, past the seating rows, straight down the center aisle meant for brides and fairy tales. I heard someone whisper, "Is that her?" Another said I thought she wasn't invited. I didn't slow. I spotted Marlena's mother first. Margaret Goss, near the hors d'oeuvre table, her pearl necklace tight around her throat like a collar. When she saw me, her hand trembled just slightly and the toothpick she was holding slipped from between her fingers. She tried to pretend she hadn't seen me. But she had. I saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes, the way she leaned into her husband, whispering, then pretending to laugh. It was always her strategy. Keep smiling even when the room was cracking around you. But this time the cracks were louder than the music. I moved closer. Marlena stood by the altar. White lace, diamond earrings, painted grace. She was radiant, picture perfect, and frozen. Her hand curled tightly around her bouquet when she saw me. Her lips parted, but no words came. Behind her, Damon hadn't turned around yet. He was still speaking to the officiant, still smiling, still unaware. That was about to change. I stopped midway down the aisle. I didn't step onto the altar. I didn't touch the chairs. I just stood there where everyone could see me. The stars on my shoulders gleamed. And finally, Damon turned. His expression didn't change at first. His eyes blinked once like they couldn't quite understand what they were seeing. Then his face stiffened. He saw the uniform. He saw me. His mother. The one he'd erased in red ink. The one who now stood in front of everyone not to disrupt, but to exist. Fully. Undeniably. His lips pressed into a line. Marlena whispered something, but he didn't answer. The string quartet trailed off mid-note. Somewhere near the back, a photographer's camera clicked. Then another. I turned slightly facing one of them. "You'll want this shot," I said softly. "You don't see this every day." The photographer nodded instinctively, already snapping. A child near the back whispered to her mother, "Mommy, who's that lady?" Her mother didn't answer. Because no one could answer. Not in a way that made them look blameless. I didn't say a word to Damon. Not yet. I wanted him to feel the moment, to feel the weight of the silence he'd created, the one he thought would protect him from what he didn't want to face. But the thing about silence is, it doesn't last when truth walks into a room. People began to part subtly at first. Some looked away, some leaned in. No one told me to leave. No one dared. Not this time. Because I wasn't there as a mother begging for forgiveness. I was there as someone who had survived everything they built to destroy her. And I wasn't invisible anymore. The silence wasn't shocked anymore. It was waiting. Every head had turned. Every eye was fixed. And I, still standing beneath the wedding arch they'd built without me, had no reason to hurry. So I didn't. I reached slowly into my inside jacket pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive. Matte, plain, the kind of object that would mean nothing unless you knew exactly what it contained. I held it lightly between two fingers, raised just enough for the guests to see. Then I spoke. Calm, level, no theatrics, just truth. I have a gift, I said, for the happy couple. A few confused chuckles rippled through the crowd, but not from the front row, not from Damon, and certainly not from Ethan Goss standing stiff beside the stage, his hand halfway to his pocket. His expression collapsed in real time. His color drained faster than the champagne in his glass. He knew what this was. Marlena stepped forward, lips trembling. "What is this?" she asked. "You're not well. You shouldn't be here. This is cruel." I tilted my head slightly. "Cruel is the price of pretending." She faltered. Damon looked down at his shoes, still silent. I stepped closer. "This drive contains a confession," I said. "From Staff Sergeant Colton Rivas, the man who admitted to falsely implicating me in a breach that destroyed my career." A collective breath drew in behind me. He named names. He named companies. One of them was Maverton Holdings. Now heads turned. Not toward me, but toward Ethan. I kept going. "It also contains a copy of an email sent by your groom." I glanced at Damon. 3 months after the court-martial. An apology. One he never sent publicly. One that admitted he never asked me if I did it. Marlena's eyes whipped toward Damon. He looked like he might throw up. I turned again now, facing Ethan directly. And finally I said, voice still low, "There's evidence tying Maverton Holdings to international defense contract fraud, offshore laundering, and coercion of military personnel to commit perjury." The hush broke like glass. A man in the second row stood up. "I'm one of Maverton's investors," he said. "Are these allegations credible?" "Ask your CEO," I replied. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. That's when the phones came out. Guests began filming. Some moved closer. The atmosphere shifted not toward chaos, but confrontation. The kind that has waited too long. Marlena tried again. "She's unstable. She's obsessed with revenge. This is delusion." I ignored her. "Marlena," I said gently, "you deserve to know who you're marrying." I held the USB out, offering it not to her but to the officiant standing frozen at the altar. He took it, hands shaking. Then, just as I stepped back, we heard it. Sirens, not distant, not delayed, direct. Approaching fast. 2 black SUVs rolled through the gates like thunderclouds on wheels. Doors opened. Jackets marked FBI flooded the stone path like water spilling into every crevice. Ethan spun, bolted down the side stairs. He didn't get far. Agents tackled him at the fountain. 3 swift movements, precise and practiced. One had cuffs out before Ethan even hit the ground. The other secured a briefcase he hadn't let go of since the ceremony began. Guests screamed. Some ran. Most stayed still, stunned, recording. The air was no longer floral or celebratory. It was truth-scented and thick. An agent approached me. A tall woman with sharp eyes. "General Barrett," she said. I nodded once. She extended a hand. "Thank you for your cooperation. We have everything." I didn't shake her hand. I didn't need to. I turned instead to the crowd. Not all of them looked at me with admiration. Some were confused, some angry, some scared. But they were looking, really looking. And for the first time in years, they weren't pretending I wasn't there. Marlena collapsed into a chair, head in hands. Damon stood alone now, no one beside him, no cameras flattering his angles. I said nothing to him. Not yet. I didn't need to. This wasn't about him, it never really was. This was about a mother who came to finish a story they tried to rewrite without her. And who did so. Not with rage, but with proof. I stepped back, let the scene unfold without me. Because sometimes the most powerful presence is the one that finally stops asking to be understood. The estate was quieter now. The guests had scattered like birds startled from a garden. The music had stopped hours ago, the strings abandoned mid-measure. Waitstaff stood awkwardly by the catering tables, unsure whether to clean or vanish. Somewhere a generator hummed. And I, still in uniform, the stars on my shoulders catching the fading light, walked through the stone hallway of the house I once entered as a daughter-in-law candidate. Not by marriage, but by obligation. Now I entered as no one's guest, and everyone's reckoning. The hall still smelled of roses and champagne. But underneath that, beneath the curated elegance and manicured wealth, was something colder. The scent of papered-over secrets. I paused near the grand staircase where portraits of Marlena's family lined the walls in symmetrical order. Painted smiles, frozen legacies. Nothing out of place. Except me. A few doors down I heard a voice. Low. Tired. I stepped into the main foyer. And there he was. Damon. Standing in the center of the marble floor, hands hanging limp at his sides. The tie had come undone. His jacket was off. One cufflink missing. The kind of unraveling that doesn't come from disaster, but from something deeper. Confrontation. I didn't announce myself. I just walked in. He turned. Our eyes met. For the first time in years, he didn't look away. Not with shame, not with anger, but with something closer to vacancy. He spoke first, voice hoarse. They said you were bluffing. I raised an eyebrow. And you believed them. He didn't answer. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us slowly. The silence stretched. I'm not here to punish you, I said. He looked confused, almost startled by that. I came because I needed to say one thing, and I need you to answer honestly. He nodded once. So I asked it. Why didn't you ever ask me if I did it? The question sat in the room like smoke. Damon's mouth opened, closed. His shoulders lifted, then sank. Finally, he ran a hand through his hair and said, Because I didn't think I could survive it if you had. The honesty hit harder than any denial. He went on. You were always more, stronger, smarter. You never needed anything. Not even from me. You wore that uniform like it was stitched from steel, and I always felt like I didn't belong next to you. Like I was just someone orbiting your life. I swallowed. The stars on my collar suddenly felt heavier. You thought I didn't need anything from you, I said slowly. But all I ever wanted, especially when it fell apart, was for you to ask, just once, to look me in the eye and say, I believe you. Damon sat down heavily on the edge of the staircase, elbows on knees, hands clasped like a boy trying to explain a broken window. I didn't know how he said. I told myself you were gone, that you chose the army over us, that if I made space, maybe I could finally be enough for someone. I stood there a moment, watching him try to justify years of silence with one cracked explanation. He didn't cry, neither did I. We had both run out of things to cry about long ago. You weren't supposed to fix it, I told him gently. I never needed that. I just needed to not be alone in it. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the little boy in his face. The one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder in the back seat. The one who used to wait at the window when I came home from training. "I'm sorry," he said so quietly I almost missed it. I nodded. But I didn't say, "It's okay." Because it wasn't. And that was the point. I stepped back. Let the space grow again. Not as punishment, but as boundary. "I have to go," I said. "Where?" he asked. I looked out the window. The last of the daylight was slipping across the garden, and beyond it the rest of the world. Unfiltered, uncurated, and finally free of their version of me. "Where I'm needed," I said. He didn't stop me. He didn't chase me. But he didn't look away either. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 1 week later, I found myself back where it all began. But not in the way I ever expected. The Pentagon's formal hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning held behind secured glass, inside a sealed conference room. Not many were present. Just enough to witness it being done properly this time. No flashing cameras. No red ink. Just signatures. Silence. And the weight of acknowledgement. A single folder was placed before me, heavier in meaning than in paper. Across the top, General Lucinda Barrett. Inside it, a summary. All prior disciplinary action formally nullified. All rank and clearances restored. Commendations reinstated retroactively. And then the final line read aloud by a high-ranking official with a voice like marble. "We apologize for the damage caused to your record, your reputation, and your well-being. The United States Department of Defense recognizes the error." I didn't cry. I didn't nod or thank them. I simply breathed. Because you can only hold your breath for so many years before your lungs forget how to trust the air again. As I left the building, I saw James Carter waiting for me by the corridor. He didn't smile, just that same small twitch of the brow that meant something between respect and concern. "They're preparing to nominate you," he said as we walked. "Medal of Freedom." I stopped. Let the weight of those words hover in the hallway. "I don't want a medal," I said after a long pause. "I don't want a podium. I'm not a symbol." "I know," James said softly. "But maybe justice needs one." He handed me another envelope, thinner, sealed in deep red. I didn't open it. "Operation Harrow," he explained. "Pentagon wants you to lead it. It's a full-scale internal sweep. Deep end. Classified tiers. We're talking about the ones who signed off on the erasure. The ones who thought you'd disappear." I looked down at the seal. Thought of how many times I had worn that emblem on my chest, not knowing the very institution behind it would one day turn its back. I didn't give him an answer then. I just told him I needed time. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove up the coast in silence, windows down, night air whipping through my sleeves like an old familiar wind. I drove through towns too small for maps past gas stations that hadn't updated their signs in decades. Eventually, I reached Point Astor. No gate, no sign, just a small break in the guardrail off Highway 1. A dirt road that curved like memory down toward the cliffs. I hadn't been here in 35 years. Back then, I was 22. Fresh out of officer school, all nerve and notebooks. I'd stood right here once fumbling with a compass in the mist, trying not to let the others see my hands shake. This time I stood still. No compass, no orders, just me. Whole, unclaimed by anyone else's version of me. The wind was stronger up here, the kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that strips away everything performative. I walked toward the edge of the bluff. The Pacific spread out below, crashing endlessly against jagged black rock. The horizon was beginning to blur, sun setting slow gold spilling into blue. I sat down in the grass, legs folded. No ceremony, no audience. From my coat pocket, I pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, the 4 silver stars, untethered now. They weren't sewn to fabric or bound to a command, they were just mine. I held them in my palm one at a time, thought of what each one had meant. The first star earned at 30, After surviving a hostage extraction in the Congolese corridor that was supposed to fail, we brought them all home. The second after leading an all-woman recon unit through 72 hours of near-constant fire in Kandahar. No one died. The third awarded in silence after I uncovered the off-book chemical funding pipeline that would have destroyed a NATO trust agreement. I was never allowed to speak of it. And the fourth, I never truly accepted the fourth. Not until now. It wasn't awarded for heroism. It was restored after they realized they could no longer deny me. I closed the box again. Didn't lock it. Didn't throw it. I just let the wind pull what it wanted through the cracks. I didn't need to burn it to prove I was free. I didn't need to bury anything to know it had value. The phone buzzed beside me. A secure line. No name. I opened it. Operation Harrow approved. Ready for lead command. Full autonomy granted. Below that one word, confirm. I stared at the screen. Let the question settle in my chest. Then I looked up, out over the sea, over the years, over every version of myself that had tried to survive inside someone else's definition of woman soldier mother. I thought of Damon standing alone in that marble hallway, not asking me to stay, but not looking away either. I thought of every person who had once turned their back, not with malice, but with comfort in ignorance. And I realized I didn't need to be welcomed back. I didn't need to be vindicated by headlines or saluted by strangers. I just needed to stop apologizing for surviving. So I rose, stepped back toward the Jeep, its engine still warm. I climbed in, tossed the envelope with my orders onto the passenger seat, not as rejection, as possibility. I looked at the blinking screen again. Didn't hit confirm. Not yet, because for the first time in decades, I wasn't rushing. I wasn't running. I was choosing. The road stretched ahead like a blank page, and this time the only name writing on it was mine. If you've ever been shut out of a story you helped build, if you've ever stood quietly in a room full of people and still felt completely unseen, or if you've carried the weight of betrayal in silence wondering if anyone would ever understand, then maybe you know sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's the choice to keep going, without permission. Has there ever been a moment when you had to prove who you were, without saying a word? If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Just write "I understand" or share your own turning point, however small. And if you're drawn to stories of quiet courage, dignity, and women who rise on their own terms, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you'll be here for the next one, because your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard.